I'm excited to be here. I was last here 5 years ago. I feel like I've been here kind of vicariously since then, as some of my colleagues, Allison DeFranco has been here, Steve Esty and his wife, I know were with you last month. And I've been on many Skype calls with my Kodo friends. So it's really a pleasure to be back here. And when I was here 5 years ago, Trinidad and Tobago had not yet ratified the convention. That has changed. I'm delighted about that. And also, I did a little research and I found that countries throughout this region have gotten on board with the convention. This region was a little bit slow on ratifying the treaty, but that's turned around now. So now we are in implementation phase, right? And I think our task for the next 2 days is to think about how a framing of human rights and how these human rights treaties, negotiated up there at the UN, how can they be useful advocacy tools right here in your community, not just at the national level. We need to push at the national level, but at the community level, whether in awareness raising, whether in talking and sensitizing teachers or health professionals, within our own families and so forth. So this next 2 days is for you all, and I hope that we're going to actively engage and kind of work with some of these ideas, framings, and these these two documents that we're really going to focus on, which is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We'll kind of focus on that today, and then the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And we have a beautiful wall hanging in the back, which gives a great overview of the convention. So make sure you look at that during the coffee break. It's a very nice wall hanging. And I think it's going to be fun. We're going to have fun. And the idea is to make it relevant. And if it's not feeling relevant, my expectation is that you all will say, wait a minute, let's back up, slow down. How does this really relate to the challenges that we're facing? Now, I come to this issue of disability rights. I started out professionally in the international campaign to ban landmines. I'm a lawyer by training, and I think I was, pulled into this issue for lots of reasons. Probably a big reason, I think probably, is that both of my parents were individuals with disabilities. So my mother was born with a disability. She had spina bifida, so she experienced some pain and physical disability throughout her whole life. She was an amazing woman and a great social justice advocate. And my father acquired very serious mental illness. He was a brilliant mathematician, acquired mental illness, and took his own life when I was 5 years old. So that probably explains a little bit about why I'm here and why I've focused my work in this area. Sometimes we're unconsciously pulled in particular directions. And I'm a parent of 2 kids, and my son, when he was younger, had epilepsy. He had childhood epilepsy. He's since recovered from that. So I have just a little bit of a understanding of what it's like to be a parent of a child with a scary condition. It was very scary for me dealing with that. And I have had the great pleasure of working in a lot of places with parents of children with disabilities. I think there's no constituency more energized and passionate. Whether I've worked in China with parents, I've worked in Egypt with parents, I've worked in other countries, and of course in my own community in the United States. So it's always a pleasure and an honor for me to work with parent advocates. So let's go through and kind of review really roughly what we're going to do today. We're going to really start broad, okay? We're going to work in a sort of inverted pyramid. That's what my human rights education mentor taught me. And as this has been described to me, Sharda said this is something like a train the trainers, right? We're going to build some knowledge, of course, but we're also going to practice some skills. We're going to do some exercises, and maybe those are exercises you might be able to do in your own communities or use in some way, right? So we're going to give you some of those materials and tools. So we're going to start thinking broadly about attitudes and barriers to human rights of children with disabilities and to realizing disability rights. We'll talk a little bit about myths and stereotypes around children with disabilities in this community, in your community, in Trinidad and Tobago, okay, in your local community. And we'll start talking a little bit about the principles that inform the Convention on the Rights of the Child. This is a convention, a treaty, international treaty, that was adopted by the United Nations in 1989. It's kind of an old treaty, right? And it does address disability. It actually references disability in its non-discrimination clause. And that's a big deal, because the treaties that came before that did not, in their clause that prohibits discrimination, they didn't list disability as a prohibited ground. It was kind of invisible. Right? Human rights treaties apply to everyone, but really, very largely, disability was not visible in the human rights framework. But the Convention on the Rights of the Child starts to change that, and there's also an Article 23 in that convention that specifically addresses children with disabilities. Okay, so that was progress at the time. That was definitely progress. And then, of course, we'll be spending a lot of time looking at the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So one thing I'd like us to think about is what's the change from the Convention on the Rights of the Child to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities? How is disability framed? How are children with disabilities addressed? Is there a difference there? Let's compare and contrast a little. Let's get right into identifying what you see as the core challenges, let's say myths. Actually, I'll start with this, the World Report on Disability, then we'll move to thinking about the context here. So just World Report on Disability. It's a useful document. If you are not familiar with it, you can look it up online. It was published in 2011, and it was done by the World Bank and the World Health Organization. And it's a very useful study of disability across, globally and across many different sectors, including education, including health, including employment, including attitudinal issues, challenges, etc. And it tells us that there's between 93 and 150 million children with disabilities in the world. It also tells us that the world population of persons with disabilities is at least 15% of the world's population. That's really important because prior to this report, there was no sort of global assessment of the population. That's a huge problem for convincing, ministries of finance and development that this is an important population whose needs and rights merit attention. And then we know from the studies that the World Report brings together that children with disabilities are less likely to attend school, and they have limited opportunities for employment and so forth. So it's really a sort of domino effect of no education or poor education, education without supports, leading to, really exclusion from the community, exclusion from economic opportunity, and so on. So that's an important report that provides helpful baseline information. So this is an exercise I like to start with. It could be an exercise that you do with teachers, with administrators, with other parents, with self-advocates, persons with disabilities, children with disabilities. It's sort of a myths and stereotypes exercise. You could do this in a small group, you could do this in a large group setting, but we're going to do this in a plenary setting here. Each table, let's give you a chart, piece of paper, and what I'd like you to do is generate a list. Okay? One sheet for each table. I'd like you to generate a list of myths and stereotypes about specifically children with disabilities. Okay? Let's think about children with disabilities, and today we're focusing on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So what do you see as common attitudes, myths around disability in Trinidad and Tobago, in your own community?
Okay. One we came up with, people like to say it's the parents' fault. The parents did something, that is why the child came out like that. Something, you did something bad and that's what happened. Yeah. Some people like to feel that the disability that's being displayed is not permanent, probably child acting, so you don't have to take it serious. That persons with disabilities are not smart and they can't do anything for themselves, so you need to be assisting them always. And a lot of parents do this, they hide their children away because they feel somebody with a disability is not supposed to be seen in public. As well, they don't think they are capable of functioning in society, they're not capable of doing a job. So they don't provide them with the necessary skills that they need to. Right, some people are afraid of persons with disabilities. They feel there's something, they either will catch it, if it is contagious, they will catch it, or they need to avoid them. Sorry. Yes, so some people think that disability is something you have to see. So if you can see somebody walking with a cane or in a wheelchair, then that's a disability. But a child who may be acting out or doing something, that person don't have a disability. They have a discipline problem, however, right? And the parents did not train them. So that's why they're performing that way, okay? And some people and some teachers do it. They act very aggressive to the student because they think if they are kind of aggressive and they can beat it out of them. So, that's what the child needs. Need some licks and things to get that behavior out. And it's not associated with the disability that the child may have. Some people do not respect persons with disabilities. Somebody in a wheelchair and they feel they could just come all over it and do whatever, put your foot on it. Say, no, you need to ask if it's okay. You can't just, ignore them. And as we said, some people feel they're helpless. They can't do anything, so they don't give them the opportunity to think and to bring any ideas forward. So that's what we have.
So what our group did is, if not visible or extreme, the person is not disabled. Meaning that if you don't know about being disabled, then you are not disabled, which shouldn't be, because if you see someone in a wheelchair, sometimes I have my daughter in a wheelchair standing on the pavement looking to cross the road, and the drivers will just be driving like they don't care. It's not their business, it's not them being disabled, so they just pass by. Sometimes you have the sign in the back of your vehicle and they run into your vehicles. This we need, as a nation, we need this to stop. disabled persons are not useful to society, that's a no-no. They are human beings just as we are human beings. God made us in His own image and likeness, for some reason. So we have to treat them just as a normal person. Number 3, disabled is an expense to society. Some people in the government ministries think that because in social welfare, there are programs for children with disability, and for some reason, they don't want to give you the money. They come home in your house, they expect to see your children, don't have a television, they don't have running water, they want to see your place run down. And when you try to build your child or children as a normal child, they don't want to give you the funds. That's a no-no also. Once disabled person should be hidden. I'm a mother of a 16-year-old. Her father passed away when she was 3 years. And as a mother with a 16-year-old girl with disabled, I have 2 other sons, one 24, one 21. And believe you me, my sons were afraid of their sisters because of how people treated her, right? And I sat and I spoke to them and I tell them, she's a human being just as you. It's just something happened to her after birth because she was a normal baby at birth. And she got fed at the hospital and she was choking on her feed and she got brain damage. And I explained to them that this is their sister, they have to treat her just as I treat them. I carry my daughter up and down the steps on my back each and every day. I took her to the bathroom to bathe her each and every day, and it's not a problem. I dress her. I have pictures of her I could show you all. She looked as normal as anybody in this room. I love her just as anybody in this room, and we all have to love our disabled children just as everybody in this room. The last one, as a nation, we are still in denial, and this is truth, because we are in denial up to this age, 2017, that people don't recognize that there are people with disability. There are people with disability, UE with masters. They are disabled. Look at this girl who is cerebral palsy and she's in a wheelchair. She graduated just the other day. She's disabled. You understand? The other girl with no hand, she's disabled. She's an attorney. So we as a nation and we as parents with disability, we need to take the utmost steps to show the country and the people of our nation that children with disability are human beings just as anybody, and our government. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, so some of ours, like you said, would overlap with others, but I'll read them nevertheless. So top one was result of poor parenting, or was the parents' fault, something that the parents did, or lack of being able to discipline your child. Second, some people believe it's due to the area you come from, because you live in a certain area or originate in a certain area, you're more prone to being having disabilities. There's another one we've put here, is that it's due to a spiritual curse. Some people, I've had somebody say that to me once, she needs, my daughter needs prayers and I should take her to a certain place and stuff like that. So that does happen here in Trinidad and Tobago. Yeah. Prone to disability because of your gender, like you might be more prone to being autistic because you're male or something like that. Some people believe that. Another one that's been mentioned before is that disabilities are shameful and to be hidden. And on our table we're discussing, even our own former Prime Minister, she has a granddaughter apparently who is autistic and nobody knew about it, and she would have been in a perfect position to advocate and, discuss with the ministers she was in charge of to do things differently for people with disabilities, and she didn't, as far as I know. People believe that people with disabilities can't learn and they're not educatable. You can't educate them, and that they're not normal people. And I have a story about that, but it might take up too much time, so I won't go into it. that there's a disability, that there's a look that disability has. You know, I can look at somebody, and because my daughter doesn't have that look, but people are like, oh, she doesn't look disabled, you know? And it's ridiculous. People think that they're stupid and that they're charity cases. Loretta mentioned that one, so it's like, oh, they deserve handouts. And it's like everybody wants to do something to, you know, charity related to disabilities, and it's not always something to feel good about, you know. The other thing that they're not employable, I think people on that table mentioned that, and also that it's something that you did in pregnancy that caused you to have a child with disabilities. Like, what did you do? What did you eat? You know, did you fall down or something like that? You know, that caused you to have a child with disabilities. So that's our list. Yeah.
All right, so the first one is that they cannot learn. So a lot of people have the notion that persons with disabilities doesn't have, well, the capacity to actually take in information and learn anything. They should be segregated, meaning that they should be excluded from everything and be by themselves, for example, in the school systems. They have a superstition as well, so I guess that could fall under the superstitious, that they can't learn, they're stupid, you know, they just don't know how to do anything by themselves. They can't be independent. People think it's a disease, it's contagious, meaning that if you sit next to them, that you'll get it, you'll catch something from them, so they tend to stay away from them. They're invisible, they don't exist. So you would see persons with parents with disabled children going out, and you know, a person would come up to them. An example was one parent at the table was saying that they would come up and talk to her and say, how you going, how's she going, and she's right there. You know, they wouldn't ask her, thinking that she wouldn't understand. She cannot say anything back, she doesn't comprehend anything. So they're always invisible to persons who would be there, you know? So it's like they don't exist. They don't understand, they can't communicate. People always think that they are a child, meaning that they can't grow up. They don't have the capacity to think beyond a certain age. Even though they're, let's say, 20, 30, a teenager, they always think about them as a child. They presume that they are dangerous or aggressive, meaning that they could always act out, be violent, hit somebody, bite somebody. They should be cured, meaning that I guess as the medical model, they think that there is a cure for it, and that this is something that is only for like a time limit, and it would always get better at the end. And all disabilities are the same, meaning that they don't understand. Autism has different spectrums, cerebral palsy, all is not the same. They always think that it's one basic disability, and they pity them, meaning that they feel sorry for them. So that's basically our list. Yeah.
We are overlapping with a few of the groups. One of the things we did not write, and it only occurred to me as the last group presented in terms of communication, and I think it's a huge myth where a lot of people assume that communication means verbal. That's not necessarily so. A non-verbal person can still communicate, they just don't communicate with their mouth. So I only thought of it as the last group, so I took the liberty of adding that in. The other myths and stereotypes that we discussed were that a lot of people believe there are sufficient public special needs schools. A few weeks ago, I was on a guest on a television show, and they posed a question to a man on the street. Basically, do you think special needs children should be integrated? And 90% of the respondents said they have their own schools, which is not true. The belief that special needs is a rarity, and there are not that many of them. A lot of people think that. Stemming what other people discuss, that children with disabilities are limited in what they can achieve, that they are not educatable, and also the fact that a lot of people believe it does not make economic sense to attempt to educate them. The belief that public health care is easily and readily available, and not just general health, but specifically vision, dental, hearing. Average appointment at Drutchy is 6 to 9 months wait. So that then means a parent has to put out money if they can't wait that time, or wait that time, but it compounds the effect it might be having on the child. The belief as well that therapy is affordable and available. Therapy is expensive, very, okay? And at least with regards to autism, the average number of hours is supposed to be 20 hours of therapy a week. That's what's recommended. My child does 1 hour a week, okay? That's what I can afford. Aside from that, though, the number of occupational therapists, as an example, is very limited within the country. It's grown drastically, but it's still limited for what is needed. They believe that all parents are fine and coping. No, we're not. I'm tired. I need like a 2-week vacation. Yes, a month. A little funny story. I have a cousin in hospital right now. Nothing serious, but they have to keep him for monitoring for a few days. And I went to visit him yesterday. And I'm visiting him, and in the back of my head, I'm thinking, oh my God, this would be so awesome to be hospitalized for a few days, just so I would not have to deal with anything. No, we are not fine and coping. They believe that all teachers are qualified. So people think that if, especially with my child where he's high functioning, he can speak, he's incredibly smart, they think he can fit into the regular school system. He can't. The teachers might be willing, but they're not trained. They don't know what to do. And finally, that responsibility falls only on mothers. So we have to represent our daddy here. There are many, many dads who are just, if not more, involved in their children and who are taking that effort and interest.
You do have champions in the government. They have limited resources at their disposal, okay? And as advocates, you have to figure out a way to, work around the realities, the resource constraints, and come up with solutions. We all know the problems, right? But you have to be creative and come up with some solutions. And absolutely, things are not going to happen overnight, but you can see incremental change. Only in the 5 years since, I was last in Trinidad and Tobago, there has been change, right? I can see that because I was here, then I was away. I come back, there has been change. It's hard to see that necessarily when we're so close to it. It's hard for me to see that in my own community. But there has been positive change. There are champions in the government, right? And one thing we can't always do is just hammer. We have to find the right nail. I'm not a carpenter, so my analogy is going to start failing me quickly. But and remember to give credit where credit's due, right? And I think at this point in time, credit is due to the Office of the Attorney General and the Attorney General for some of the progress being made in looking at the legislative framework and in crafting a report to the CRPD committee. I mean, these are tangible steps, and there's some other positives out there. So remember to give credit, look for solutions. We all know the problems, and we can sit here together and talk about the problems, and we can complain to each other about the frustrations, etc. But to be strategic advocates, we need to use the right channel, right? And figure out what the right channel is given our audience. We're going to use different strategy if we're talking to a minister versus, another advocate and so on. Okay, so I want to move on. We can take a break, and people can certainly feel free to get up and get refreshment if you need it. But really the purpose of this exercise is to kind of create a space in a workshop setting for people to share experiences, right? In this case, we're talking about myths and stereotypes around disability. It's brought out a lot of rich discussion already. And then we want to tune into the impacts of these myths and stereotypes. And we've already generated some really concrete examples of that. These attitudes, these myths and stereotypes around disability lead to discrimination, exclusion, isolation, invisibility in law and policy of persons with disabilities, and so forth. So that's important, and it's tough because a law cannot change an attitude, a belief system, right? So you need to figure out how to help bring about that change. The government has a role. They should be investing. They're required under the Disability Treaty to invest in awareness raising and campaigning, but civil society has a very important role as well, right? So, I'm going to switch ahead. And I want to talk about, you know, we talked about myths and stereotypes around disability, and that kind of ought to lead us to the conclusion that the way we think about disability matters, right? The way we think matters. So, and we've talked a little bit about social exclusion, and you gave examples, right? So, what is social exclusion? I think we need to kind of understand that dynamic and how it works if we're going to tackle it or combat it, right? So I like to think of social exclusion as a dynamic, multi-dimensional process. It's complex. It's fueled often by unequal power relationships. It works across different dimensions: economic, political, social, cultural, we could say legal as well. It operates at different levels, you know, individually, within the household or family, group, community, country, global levels, because at the global level, persons with disabilities were totally invisible in all the international treaties and declarations. That's why we needed a treaty specifically on the rights of persons with disabilities. And it results in this continuum of inclusion, exclusion, unequal access, inequality of opportunity. So, what has been the response of the disability community to this dynamic of social inclusion? Is there another way of framing or thinking about disability, different from what we have on our chart paper? Let's move on and share with, and I'm sure many of you may be familiar, maybe not with this diagram, but this is the framing of disability that emerged from United Kingdom, and disability studies scholars really first embraced it. It's the social model of disability, and it's exactly that idea that the barriers that persons with disabilities confront, that their family members, caregivers confront, are external. They are societal barriers, right? And so that's what you see. You see the barriers in society, and they're categorized in this diagram in 3 different ways. First of all, the environmental barriers, exactly what you were talking about. Inaccessibility of buildings, services, language barriers, communication barriers, right? Attitudes, of course, the prejudice, stereotyping, discrimination, the myths that we've just talked about are barriers, examples of barriers. And organizational barriers, organizations that are inflexible, procedures and practices. Organizations can be businesses, you know, that hire persons but that are not accommodating, that do not accommodate persons with disabilities. Could be organizations, could be mainstream human rights organizations or other charity organizations that are not really inclusive of persons with disabilities, inflexible procedures and practices and so on. So the idea of the social model is to turn on its head this notion of disability as something inherent and lacking in the individual, right? Moving away from this concept like, oh, a person with disability needs to be cured. Well, Steve Esty is deaf. But he's not going to be cured. He doesn't need to be cured. He needs to be accommodated, right? So it's this idea then that when we frame disability in this way, what's the result? If you're framing disability in this kind of way, looking at barriers in society, what is the result of that? Why does that help us? How will that help us in our advocacy, thinking about disability in a different way? What's that? Yeah, exactly. We can change that. We're not going to, right, exactly. It refocuses us. Helps us, first of all, to identify barriers and then figure out about how we can tackle them and combat them. And that's a real shift. If we're not thinking about disability in this way, what's going to be our approach, let's say, to law or policy or practice? Well, we might think about, oh, well, we better focus on health interventions or rehabilitation interventions. We've got to fix the disability. If we can't fix, maybe we have to segregate and separate and isolate. So this is really kind of the first step in the disability rights movement, trying to turn on its head these attitudes around disability. So the social model of disability, really, really important, and we'll see how it's reflected in a minute. But I want to contrast that with the medical model of disability that one of you referenced in the presentations. Medical model of disability, by contrast, right, situates disability as being something inherent in the individual, the problem of an individual, a deficit, that which needs to be cured, and so on. And certainly, impairments and chronic illness may cause real challenges and difficulties, but they are not the main problems under this approach. Right, so under this sort of traditional view could be also classed as a charity model of disability or individual model of disability. Disability caused by physical, sensory, mental impairment. It's something about an individual. The individual is the problem, and then the individual becomes the focus of the medical, primarily medical rehabilitation professionals, right? So, and we see this in laws and policies. If we look at older human rights treaties, we're not going to see too many references to persons with disabilities. And secondly, where there is a reference, it will either be in a provision on health or in a provision that talks about social welfare policies. That's it. Right? So these framings matter. They matter, and we'll see the next couple of days whether and how we have progressed from this way of thinking. So these are two, ways to help us think about framings of disability, and they're models you can use in your own awareness activities and discussions and so forth, and in your own self-advocacy work, with self-advocates as well. So then, to summarize, traditional models focus on the individual rather than on society, locates causes of social inequality and a disadvantage in the mind or the body of individuals with impairments, right? Impairments viewed as an individualized problem, so we need care or we need interventions of a medical nature, or protection, right? We need to protect. And this is really the view that's dominated law and policy and practice and programming, right? And in the former Soviet Union, there is this deeply entrenched system of rehabilitation, and the name given to experts in rehabilitation under the system, the name is defectologist, right? That kind of tells you what the focus is, defectologist. So language also matters, and we'll kind of reflect a little bit on kind of progressive development over time of language and what a lot of advocates call people first language, right? So we'll talk about that as well. So I've kind of started to answer this next question, is that do models of disability have a connection to international law and policy or to domestic law and policy and to the policies and practices of organizations? We've kind of answered that question, but I want to give you just a few specific examples. Now, this first is from the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and it's a response of the committee, this treaty body in Geneva, to a government report. And it talks about how the committee is concerned that legislation, policies, and programs still have provisions on the rights of persons with disabilities that have derogatory terms, that don't comply with this human rights model of disability. Okay, so even the committee, the treaty body that monitors how states are doing in complying with the convention, that committee is concerned certainly about laws and policies and their content, but they're also concerned about how disability and persons with disabilities are framed in those laws and policies, because that matters, that impacts, it has an impact. So here's a question, and I want you to give me the answer. What model of disability do you think this reflects? And I'll read this out loud. Disability is an evolving concept. Disability results from the interaction between persons with impairments and attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinders their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. And if you had to say what model of disabilities does that reflect, what would be your answer? Social model, right. Social model of disability, because it's focusing on that interaction between impairment and environment, right? And this is from the preamble to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Now this next one is from an electoral code of a country. The right to vote shall be denied to one who is insane or retarded. What model does that reflect? Not a very nice model. And what model of disability? And I've got two posters. On the left is Down Syndrome Ireland. Just because I've got Down syndrome doesn't mean I won't use my vote. And then on the right-hand side is an old Muscular Dystrophy Association of America poster. It says, "Wish I could tell him now that his," and then down below the text reads, "that his body will grow strong and straight, that someday he'll walk as others do, that he'll live out his normal years." Medical on the right-hand side, the old Muscular Dystrophy March of Dimes poster, now much maligned by social model theorists and disability studies people, right? And then on the left, what model of disability? Social model, yeah. Could be, and we could even, maybe rights-based model, or maybe both. Good. Okay, so, and we could go on and on with these different examples. We could come up with examples from Trinidad and Tobago. We could come up with examples of looking at media portrayals of disability, positive and negative. And I think the point is that framings matter, and having people think about and talk about different framings of disability can be a really useful exercise and kind of a point of departure for then talking about the impact, right? And maybe specific examples of discrimination. And that's really important, the framing and conception of disability, a really important tool for us to work with as we scrutinize and critique laws, policies, programs, even the missions of organizations, looking at how organizations describe their work, how are organizations thinking about persons with disabilities? How is that reflected in their practices, right? And what impact might that have? Why does it matter? You know, and we know that as activists and advocates, it's not, language matters, and it really matters in the context of disability, given what you all have shared about the pervasiveness of negative attitudes around disability in Trinidad and Tobago. And what I can say is that really the examples you gave are very universal. Some of them are a little context specific to Trinidad and Tobago, but we've done this exercise in every part of the world, and the lists generated are very, very similar, right, unfortunately. So we're going to be talking about two different treaties in the next 2 days, the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and I'll use the acronym CRPD. They're both treaties, and they've both been ratified by your government. And ratification means the first step a country takes is they sign it, and that really means, okay, we're signing this, we like it, we need to go through our internal process, and we're hoping that we will ratify it. So then the next step is actually ratifying the treaty. And ratifying it means all the steps have been taken to take on those obligations domestically, right? And so different countries have a different process of ratifying. It may need to go through Parliament. In the United States, it needs to go through the Senate, which is why we have not ratified it, because we can't agree on anything in the Senate. Even on bipartisan issues, which disabilities have been on bipartisan, we can't ratify treaties. We did sign it, though. So ratification means all the steps have been taken. It is part of the domestic law of the country, and the government has taken on those obligations, right? So you have two tools. You have more than that, because you've ratified more than 2 treaties, but you have 2 really helpful tools that can help you know, advance the disability rights agenda and help drive reform. Okay, and use creatively in awareness raising and in, you know, trying to shift attitudinal, shift attitudes. So, great question, and continue to ask those questions if I'm using terms and not defining them, because this is all about accessibility, right? Accessibility is a very important principle, as we will see, and it's reflected in human rights law. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about attitudes and framing, ways to think about disability. We've identified the impact of those framings on our advocacy, all right, and on laws and policies and practices and programs. Now we're going to get a little bit more into thinking and looking specifically at a human rights framing, right? And it's hard to, for me, it's hard to think about a human rights framing of disability or a human rights approach to disability without the social model as a starting point. Because if I'm not understanding disability as in terms of barriers in society, then it's going to be difficult for me to be thinking in terms of a holistic and comprehensive human rights-based approach, right? If I'm focused narrowly on medical intervention or charity or rehabilitation, that's not going to allow me to think broadly and comprehensively about all human rights for all people, children and adults with disabilities, their allies, caregivers, etc. So for me, social model is a really important point of departure for then opening up a human rights-based approach. And that's kind of where we were when we were drafting the Disability Treaty at the UN. It was really important for us to start from that foundation, because when we went into the process, there were lots of governments who were very confused about what we were doing, they were thinking, first of all, that the treaty must be about preventing disability. Okay, public health has a place, but that was not the place. But this is how they were thinking of disability and thinking about it very narrowly. And then, we pushed a little bit. Then they started thinking about, well, maybe non-discrimination relates. Okay, we'll live with that. But still, they were thinking very narrowly. And we ultimately got a very broad convention, and it's largely structured around the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So we were looking at the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It was a very broad treaty, and it covers all sorts of different kinds of rights. And in human rights, we tend to categorize civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights. Now, these are all connected and interrelated, but we like to categorize things, and we categorize them in that way. But the Convention on the Rights of the Child dealt with all of this full range of issues. It dealt with civil and political rights, even for children, the right of children to express their views, to participate. The right of children to be free from torture, to be free from violence and abuse. Civil and political rights also talks about economic, social, and cultural rights, education, training, health, culture, the right to educate, the right to play, sport, recreation, and so on. So we were really wanting a broad treaty that would allow us to really kind of contextualize existing human rights, but within the context of disability, right? And how we were also thinking about how this treaty could help further develop human rights law generally. And I think there's a lot of concepts in the treaty that relate to other marginalized groups, right? To women or to children generally, or to indigenous persons, or to LGBT persons, and so on. Okay, so the Convention on the Rights of the Child was, again, it was very important for our framing and our arguing with states about what the convention should contain. And I'm going to just start off with, by way of introduction, with one slide that talks about the principles in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And this, probably more than anything, gives you the best kind of summary of really what this treaty is all about. So it talks about non-discrimination, right? That the idea that all children enjoy rights without discrimination. And as I mentioned, that includes children with disabilities. Specifically, disability is referenced, so that's important and helpful. It talks about this concept of the best interests of the child. So states are required to ensure that the central consideration of any decisions about children, whether by the courts or government offices or agencies, etc., are focused on the decision-making to further the best interests of the child. So that was another critical principle. The third was the right to life, survival, and development, and the idea that states must take measures to ensure the survival and development of children to the maximum extent possible, including taking positive measures, right? So ensuring that an educational system is well funded might be one example of taking positive measures. Ensuring that you have an appropriate healthcare system might be another example of such a measure. So the right to life and to survival and development. And then finally, as I mentioned, this right to participate. And the idea that states need to ensure that children can express their views freely in all matters affecting them. And that's a pretty radical thing for a human rights treaty to say, that children have the right to participate and they should be present and consulted in a meaningful way. So those are the key principles that underline this treaty. And those principles were kind of pulled out and highlighted over the years by the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and that's this treaty body, this committee of experts nominated in their individual capacity by governments who meet periodically in Geneva and review states' reports on how they're doing. And the committee can also issue guidance to states, general comments or recommendations on how they should think about interpreting the treaty. So in one of their most important general comments, they talked about these key principles that really inform the whole approach to child rights. So the next thing I want to do is just get us thinking about child rights, but in the context of children with disabilities, okay, so that we're thinking about the rights due to children with disabilities. And I'm just going to give you a list of rights that are reflected in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. All right, so the next slide is, and this is for some more small group work that I'd like to have you do. Okay, so there's just a list. This is not a complete list of all the rights in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but it includes quite a few of them. Okay, and then we're going to do one of Sharda's favorite exercises. And we're going to take this list, right, and each group, working in your separate groups, I would like you each to make an effects cascade. So I'm going to demonstrate, and I have really poor handwriting, but I'll try to do a good job here. So I am going to start with, well, yeah, maybe I'm just going to, hold that up. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I've selected a right that's not actually up there. It's like the right to participate in sport, right? And I'm going to put that in the middle of a circle, right? Big circle. And I will ask myself or my small group, maybe I'll go back and do this with Sharda. If this right is denied, so if the right to sport, to participate in sport, is denied to a child with a disability, because again, we're focusing on children with disabilities, what are 3 possible effects? What are 3 possible effects? So I will okay, so I'll draw, fill out at least 3 effects of the denial of the right to participate in sport for a child with a disability. What is the effect of that? Okay, and then next step, third step, I want you to think about when this effect happens, what additional rights are denied or impacted, okay? You might even have 3 or 2, okay? All right, so let me just review my instructions one more time. So you're going to write a human right, just select one from up here related to children with disabilities, and ask and discuss within your group, if this right is denied, what are 3 possible effects? Write any 3 of them below, and then take each of the 3 mentioned effects. For example, let's say if we're talking about employment, which we're not. Employment, what is an effect of the denial of the right to employment? Well, the inability to get a job or to make a living might be two effects right there. Or falling into poverty could be another effect. Then you ask what human rights would be denied by this effect, okay? And then write each right in the circle that extends with arrows from that effect, right? So if my right to employment is denied, then I won't be able to get a job or make a living, then my right to an adequate standard of living might be compromised. Okay?
So we choose the right to an education. We chose. So first denial effect would be intellectually, and another effect from intellectually would be low self-development. Um, in meaning that intellectually you not reach, a position where you know you are and you can go places like that. Um, sorry, I get nervous. Intellectually, again, another effect is devoid of learning a skill or a trade. Another effect is psychological barrier. Yeah, such as your emotions and your emotional intelligence. Yeah. Economically, loss of job opportunity. So you don't have the opportunity of having any job, any career, or anything like that. The career you want. Um, Inability to acquire financial independence, to live on your own, and to be able to sustain your livelihood. And therefore, another effect is you're stuck in poverty. So there's nowhere for you to go up, you just keep going up, and if you do go up, you climb back, you go back down. So socially, social skills, so such that you don't know how to be a friend, you don't know how to share, you know, or have relationships. So lots of interpersonal skill, um, yeah, in your family, yeah, you can communicate and get along with your family and friends and co-workers even. Um, and you're unaware of your human rights. So you don't just lack that knowledge. You don't know what you deserve and what is for you. So that you can't, excel, and you can't, again, go higher because you don't have that education. Yeah.
Okay, so what we discussed was the right to children being denied freedom from violence. The three effects that we discussed were physical health, the impact on their physical health, impact on mental health, and the loss of relationships, friendships, social contact. So some of the areas overlap a little bit, as you would imagine. With respect to physical health, there's obviously a mobility aspect. If a child is being physically abused because of a lack of understanding of their condition, they could suffer broken limbs, etc. There's also a lack of safety, and something that Adana very kindly mentioned to me just now, that you can mention is there have been recent instances in the news of police being inadequately trained to deal with individuals suffering from bipolar disorder, etc., and they're using excessive force. In some instances, they have used guns, and the people have been killed. So that would stem from physical health. Mental health. So you, first and foremost, you would have the possibility of a recurring cycle of violence. So a child, for example, being autistic, and parent does not understand, parent hits, the child then learns that as a response to situations that they don't understand, and it becomes part of their cycle. And this actually doesn't even apply to persons with disabilities. I know that was the main focus, but it applies really to all children. You would also have, with respect to mental health, the possibility of increased stress, increased anxiety, likely depression, leading to possible suicide. Low self-esteem. That would again overlap with the likelihood of depression, suicide, etc. And the low self-esteem could link to affecting their education and their ability to be educated, which would then affect their employability and their productivity, and leading to a cycle of poverty. I can give a personal example here with respect to the mental health aspect. Earlier this year, my son, we went to heal him with horses in Tobago. And there was a young man that I met there. He's 19 years old. He is severely Down syndrome, nonverbal. There were some other issues that I wasn't privy to, but there were some other concerns as well. His family had never gotten support. They did not know how to care for him, what to do with him, anything. And unfortunately, they resorted to physical means to get him to behave, to get him to do things. And it had reached a stage, it was so bad that when he was around 15, 16 was when the parents had first took him to Healing with Horses, which is a therapeutic intervention program in Tobago. And at that point in time, he could not physically be touched. If someone came up to him and they put their hand on his shoulder, he would flinch away. He was so afraid of physical contact. And the owner of Healing with Horses automatically realized this child was being abused. Every time he did something and the parents didn't understand, their resource was hit him. And it was very extreme. So he has shown significant progress in the last 4 years, but this was a clear example of someone where their entire self-esteem was being affected, and they could not verbally communicate that. They have now been able to reach a process of communication by dealing with the horses and in that environment. And then the last effect is loss of relationships, friendships, social contact. So you have the possibility of that leading to no family life. So you may have a physical family, but the child may not want to be around that family. They may withdraw. They may lose friendships, etc. And again, leading to possible anxiety, depression, suicide.
All right, so we chose to look at family life and how, if that is compromised, a person's education, freedom of torture and inhumane treatment, as well as respect for home and family life could also be compromised. From education, we looked at if that is compromised, then the person's potential ability to work and to have suitable employment is also compromised, as well as their ability to participate in cultural life and recreation suitable. And as well to have proper health care, right? All of that will be compromised if their education is compromised. When their right to freedom from cruelty and inhumane treatment is compromised, then they have freedom from exploitation also comes in, because they in a situation where they could be taken advantage of by those who have authority over them. Their privacy could also be compromised, as well as having proper socialization opportunities with other people. Under respect for home and family life, if this is compromised, then the child will also have inability to have expression, self-expression, and their opinions heard. Their relationship with others would also be compromised, as well as they will have inadequate standard of living and social protection.
Okay, we chose rehabilitation, looking at it from a human rights perspective, not the medical model. So we have health, education, and life being affected. And under health, physical and mental health, as well as that would incorporate things like participation. Under mental health and mental, it would be like coping skills, being able to cope So bringing up a lot of what another group had mentioned about all the different problems, going into depression and all these things. So the health aspect, mentally and physically, and of course the physical part, you want the person to be as fit as possible, okay, so be able to participate. Under education, social skills, which would help with friends, making friends, having friendships, play, the importance of play and communication under education, as well as, of course, employment and training and being able to get a job and so on. Life, being as independent as possible, okay, and having a voice or some sort means of being able to express their point of view, participation, care and protection. Okay.
So yeah, our group chose the right to personal mobility. We structured it slightly different, but our points are meaningful nevertheless. So if the right to personal mobility is denied, it has the following effects: social isolation, low self-esteem / fears, health, adverse impact on your health, and impact on accessibility. So if your personal mobility, the right to personal mobility is denied, and you have social isolation as a result, the consequences that it could affect your work and employment, your access to work and employment, your family life, you can't go and visit granny or auntie or whoever, or your friends. It affects your participation, your right to participation in cultural life, recreation, leisure, sport, worship, etc. And the next effect of personal mobility is low self-esteem. If you have low self-esteem, then it could affect your right to life generally. Somebody mentioned suicide and stuff like that, so I think that is applicable there. It affects your standard of living, participation in political and public life as well, because you can't get to your town meetings and whatever to make a point about things that might be of political importance. Again, personal mobility, if your right to personal mobility is affected, it could affect your health in an adverse way. So imagine if you can't get to the clinic or the hospital or whatever. In turn, if your health is affected, it affects your right to life, your right to work and employment, because you might be too ill to get to work, your right to living independently, because you might be having to rely on somebody else to look after you if you're in poor health, and your right to be included in community, as well as your right to rehabilitation. Thank you. If your right to personal mobility is denied, it affects your accessibility. This could in turn affect your right to health, because you can't access health care. It affects your right to life. Access to work and employment is affected, and your access to education is most definitely affected. As well as you suffer from discrimination. We weren't sure where to fit that in, but we feel like if you could be discriminated against if you don't have that right to personal mobility.
Hi everyone. I got the right to participate in sport, and sport is part of Article 31 of the CRPD, and we'll explore a little bit more on that tomorrow. So if the right to sport is denied, we have a lack of social inclusion. We also have a denial of opportunity to explore someone's physical talents, and of course there is a denial of health benefits. If health benefits are denied, then rehabilitation and habilitation is also compromised. And the right to proper health care is compromised. Denial of equality of opportunity and to explore their physical talents, well, that denies someone the opportunity to self-actualize. If they're talented in a particular field of sport and they're denied that opportunity, of course they will be unable to self-actualize. Again, rehabilitation and health will be affected. When we come to lack of social inclusion, there will be discrimination and ostracization in society. That person will suffer inequality of opportunity. They would not be able to access opportunities equally, on an equal basis with others, sorry. Independent living and interaction in community will also be compromised. And a lack of inclusion and participation in society. Society will be denied of the talents of and contributions of this individual who has a particular talent in sport. That's it.
Thank you. All right. Excellent. So we sort of did a full tour of different human rights, okay, that are certainly reflected in many of them in the Convention on the Rights of the Child and many more in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So this exercise, again, it's a nice way to get us thinking about the interrelationship between rights, because as human rights have evolved from the very first modern human rights document, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which has a nice, fairly comprehensive listing of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. And then we get into the two covenants. The first two modern human rights treaties separate out civil and political rights into one treaty, the Covenant on the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and another covenant treaty, Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So we have a coming together of all human rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Then we have a splitting apart in the two covenants that were adopted in 1966. This reflected the ideological division of the time during the Cold War, where you have some countries, non-communist countries privileging civil and political rights, communist countries privileging economic, social, and cultural rights. And then certainly in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, you have a coming together of rights, and the same with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So we like to emphasize the coming together of rights, the unification of rights, the interrelationship between rights, and we still see that ideological division play out at the UN and other places. All right, so, and certainly if you look at the United States, which doesn't like to ratify human rights treaties, we have ratified the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We have never ratified the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So, a little bit of human rights history for you, but it's a bit silly for us to divide the rights and not think of them in that interrelated way. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If there's one thing that I know about Trinidadians and Tobagonians, it's that you start celebrating Christmas like really early, like probably several months ago, right? October, right, okay. So in recognition of that and to get the Christmas spirit going, have a little grab bag. Just take one. Grab. Oh, she got a really good thing. Grab. It's just a grab bag, okay? But you need to work hard. Okay, this doesn't mean you can relax and let up. This means you need to work even harder. Okay? We'll have a few rounds of this. Okay, so we've kind of we've been building the edifice of disability rights. We talked a little bit about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's not a treaty, but it's a declaration, but it started the human rights, modern human rights protection, adopted in 1948 at the UN. And then we had those two covenants I talked about, the two treaties, civil and political, economic, social, and cultural rights. We've talked about the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And then, of course, the best, the biggest, the most awesome treaty of all, the UNCRPD. Who am I missing? Besides Sharda. Did I get everybody? Can I help? I'm going to get you. Let's see. Okay. And our helpers. Okay. So I'm going to put on the next video, very short clip that I showed a couple of weeks ago at Special Olympics to start a conversation around terminology, framing of disability, social model of disability. And this was something created by a self-advocate in celebration of International Down Syndrome Day at the UN. And it's kind of edgy. So that started a lot of interesting dialogue at the Special Olympics, right? Special is in the name. And the idea is not that the word special is bad in any way. Special is a good word, but the way that it's sometimes been used, and the way that some self-advocates are now, like this self-advocate, coming out and kind of challenging, well, what does that really mean in relation to what she needs or what her friends need? So I think it's a really interesting campaign that was started by self-advocates that I think makes all of us think a little bit. And certainly in the United States, special needs is very much in the lexicon still, but we're seeing some really interesting resistance and questioning of that. And I think that's really healthy, and I think that's really good. And I think when you look at the earlier human rights documents, the ones on disability, there were some that were non-binding, not treaties, but declarations, resolutions around disability. You know, you see a real development over time of the terminology. So we have, you know, references to children with mental retardation earlier on, you know, to what we now have in the CRPD, which is persons with mental, physical, sensory disabilities. The term special does not appear in the treaty, which is interesting, and there was some discussion around that. And of course, there's been a lot of advocacy to do away with the term, you know, retardation, mental retardation, and so forth, and that still goes on. So terminology is really interesting, and it's ever changing. And under a social model understanding of disability, in the preamble to the CRPD, it talks about recognizing that the concept of disability is evolving. And that is really kind of interesting. The idea that our understanding of disability, the concept, you know, changes over time, and that's actually recognized in a treaty. And which I think it's very interesting for a human rights treaty to kind of reflect that. And so the question for us and for all of you as advocates and parent advocates and people who are promoting self-advocacy is, where are all of you in that conversation, and where can that conversation and dialogue lead you in relationship to your constituencies and your community. So I wanted to share that, and I just love the humor. This is great. I think it's really clever, really edgy, and it's a great example of people with disabilities exercising self-advocacy, participation, having views known, and participating in cultural life, right? So we're seeing more and more, and I've had the opportunity to see really interesting theater troupes composed entirely of people with Down syndrome, people with intellectual disabilities, other types of disabilities, doing really interesting and edgy kinds of pieces with real advocacy messaging, So any reactions to that piece?
I just wanted to know what you thought about the terms differently abled.
Yeah, great question. So, yeah. The term differently abled, we see that, and we could probably think of, it'll be interesting, we could think of a whole variety of different types of terminology relating to persons with specific types of disabilities. So differently abled, certainly an attempt to positively portray a person with a disability, right? It's really certainly an attempt to turn this notion, the medical model notion, kind of on its head, the emphasis of inability, and turn that around to, differently able. And I think certainly where the global disability community came down on all of this in the treaty process and negotiation was the people first language, so people with disabilities, utilizing that kind of more neutral language. And some people have some issues with differently abled because it seems a little, I don't know, I'm trying to think of back to those.
It goes against inclusion, because how do you foster inclusion when the first word you use to describe someone is different?
Right, yeah. So what it's trying to achieve ultimately, arguably, doesn't achieve. And it's really interesting, I was with Charlotte McLean at a conference at the World Bank, and there was a guy who was talking about the importance of financial inclusion, including persons with disabilities in, banking, for example. That the idea that legal capacity is often, a blind person, for example, very often in some countries can't open a bank account because they can't see the contract. It's ridiculous, but and so he really knew his stuff on financial inclusion. He was way off the mark when it came to disability, So he's like, I think we should call people with disabilities people with vulnerabilities, And he was in a room full of disability advocates, and I was like cringing, So these questions around language and terminology are interesting and important. I think there's ways to have these conversations with legislators or with service providers or with others, teachers, in a way that's not hammering people over the head for things they don't know or understand, but educating. I went to an Amnesty International conference a few years ago, and this was I attended a panel on the rights of transgendered people. And this was a panel composed of transgender people. And it was such a great panel because they said, okay, you ask us any question, it's fine. And they went through this terminology, some of which was very unfamiliar to me. I was not well informed at all. And it was great because we sort of had that safe space to talk about issues, to ask questions. and really become more informed. And so I think it was refreshing for me, and I was thinking, wow, we have a lot of the same, you know, challenges and issues very often in the disability community. And there's no consensus, by the way. So Judy Heumann, who's one of the most famous American disability rights activists, she does not like people first language. She's the one who says, you know what, no, I'm a disabled person. I am disabled by the environment, right? So, and she's absolutely right. If you're thinking of that term the way it's meant to be used and grammatically, you know, she's exactly right. Yeah. The UK is...
There actually was an article recently on Facebook. I can't remember the exact, but it was a large autistic organization. And they were speaking about person first. And a lot of autistic people themselves said they don't like person first language. Because for them, their autism is part of them.
That's
and
really
personally,
well, exactly.
my
Yeah.
son, he does not like it. So I always say autistic. I don't refer to him first because that's what he likes.
Exactly.
And I've actually been corrected by people, no, you're not supposed to say that. Yes, I am, because that's what my son wants.
No, that's exactly right. And the head of the self-advocacy autism network in the U.S., it's Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, I think, it explained exactly that, and that no, I'm not a person with autism. And he explained the history of thinking about autism, and the really awful history that first, you know, blamed the refrigerator mother for an autistic child, and, you know, it's just been a mess. And the idea that it felt much more comfortable to say, I'm autistic, I'm not. Yeah, so that's interesting, and that, boy, I see it gets tricky, right? Peel away those layers and it gets really interesting and complex. But again, you know, understanding what the disability community in a given maybe culture, country, etc., how they want to self-identify, or obviously how an individual, him or herself, wants to self-identify, and they may want to, you know, they may be happier with identifying as someone who's differently abled, and that's fine, right? How people want to self-identify is fine. So I kind of tend to fall back on where we are. Like in the United States, we say people with disabilities, that's reflected in legislation. That's pretty much what I follow. But just being mindful of language and using it as an opportunity to have these kinds of discussions and dialogues. And that's really important for self-advocacy, right? For people to figure out how they identify, how they want to be identified. That's a really important conversation to have when, you know, like the conversation you had with your son on how he wants to be identified and how he identifies himself.
At the state level, when we're drafting legislation, what do we use? If everyone's coming up with a different way of identifying themselves, then what language do we use?
For legislation, it gets tricky because you want to be inclusive. You don't want to define things in such a way that you're excluding groups. So, and in the end, that's why in the disability treaty, we don't define disability at all. It's not in the definitions, which is in Article 2. There's a kind of a sort of a definition in Article 1, and the reference is made to persons with physical, sensory, and mental disabilities, feeling that that really gives a, you know, as broad coverage as possible, and that it's meant to be, you know, a baseline. So it gets tricky in legislation, certainly. Now, the beauty of a treaty that identifies the class that you're talking about is that can be guidance for governments as they put their domestic legislation in place. And so the argument was made by developing countries at the UN that we may not have a quote-unquote definition of disability, but we have to have some sense in the treaty of who we're talking about. Otherwise, we're going to really have problems domestically. We might start excluding certain groups of individuals, or we may, as much legislation does, discriminate against persons with one type of disability versus another. So that was a lengthy conversation that we had.
One of the things that occurred to me with this video is that we have been leaving out the actual persons to whom we are referring to from the conversations. So what is great about this video is that who is speaking are persons themselves, and in this particular group, persons with Down syndrome, that they get to now have, we give them a voice through years of legislation changes and what have you. Finally, they have a voice, and they can now say, "This is how I want to be referred to."
Right.
And I think that's the missing link, that they need to now be given that voice.
Absolutely. And during the treaty drafting process at the UN, the voices of people with intellectual disabilities especially was very limited. But we did have one advocate, Robert Martin from New Zealand, and he was there with Inclusion International, and he was supported by other members of the inclusion team, and he was an incredibly powerful voice in that treaty drafting process. And at the working group where we came up with the initial 25 provisions that was the basis for the treaty, Robert made some very powerful interventions. One of those was he had grown up in an institution in New Zealand, a segregated institution, and had transitioned into the community. And it wasn't the easiest transition, but he had made that transition over time. He shared that personal experience. That was powerful. For these government delegates, some of whom didn't know much about disability. And he made the point time and again that people with disabilities are people, and they shouldn't be labeled like jam jars, right? They're people. So again, getting back to thinking about language and stereotypes about disability. Well, Robert Martin, fast forward from 2002, when he first started in the process, he is now a member of the CRPD committee. He is representing persons with intellectual disability. He is the first member of a UN treaty body to have an intellectual disability. So that is huge. And Special Olympics is certainly in a period of transition. I was there a couple weeks ago at their headquarters, as I mentioned, in Washington, and they are doing more and more around self-advocacy. And I think it's very positive. But that organization recognizes the need to change. It's a relatively old, kind of old-fashioned in some ways, organization. So the UNCRPD is causing organizations, not just governments, but organizations to think about their mission, their approach to decision-making, listening, not only listening to the voice of people with disabilities, as you were saying, but obviously bringing people with disabilities into the organizations as leaders, as decision makers, and that's critical. That's been huge. And you can trace that with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, a total transition from a very charity-based model of protecting children to a more empowered model of thinking about rights, taking the views of children into account. So it's human rights treaties are not the be-all, end-all. It's what happens at the level of this country, and the governments and civil society. That's their ultimate value and worth. But you really can trace over time the power and impact of those of these human rights treaties and sort of shaping cultures, organizational cultures within the UN system itself. which didn't really do so well on disability. In fact, disability issues were not dealt with under the UN human rights system. Disability was addressed in the social development section in New York, thousands of miles away from Geneva, where all the rest of the human rights issues were being dealt with. Now that's changed because we now have the Human Rights Treaty. But again, it was the idea of shifting organizations, shifting mindsets, changing procedures, and figuring out ways to really facilitate participation. And that's obviously threatening for institutions and organizations who have done things in a certain way for a long time. Any other questions? Great questions. Yes.
My question is, what about those that are disabled that cannot speak out for themselves? Because my daughter cannot speak or do anything for herself, so what would be her position? Thank you.
And that's a great question. And there are a lot of discussion around those issues when we were drafting the treaty. How can we best give voice to people who cannot communicate or for whom we're not sure how to facilitate communication, right? In some cases, maybe thinking of schools or so on. But so you as a mother are probably extremely well placed to know best the wishes, the desires, the preferences of your daughter, right? So that's, one response is looking at, advocacy, supported advocacy, right? Supported advocacy. And I think of Robert Martin, who is a man with Down syndrome and is able to communicate, but he received support from his organization to give voice. A couple of weeks ago, I was doing some lobbying on Capitol Hill with Amnesty International, and so we had basically almost a session like this where we went through, we had talking points, we had some folks giving us the materials, kind of going through the suggestions of what we would say. So we had some leave behind materials, we had some very specific and concrete asks, very specific, and the other thing we did was we were advised to first find something to thank we were meeting with Senate staffers on Capitol Hill. Find something and they had done some research for us, so we were able to thank the senator. We really appreciate the senator's support on X. Here's what we're concerned about now, and we're really looking for the senator's support on one of the issues was the Violence Against Women's Act, for example. So finding something to thank that person for, particularly when you're talking to a decision maker, not so much in some of these other contexts, but thanking and recognizing their work, finding that connection, and then talking to specific issues, asking, and having the lead provide for information. And the more you can prepare, the better. And very often it's advocacy organizations and CODO that's doing some background work and creating those materials that are helpful for you, right? So there could be, as you go forward and you're thinking about specific campaigns to engage in, whether it's for inclusive education, accessible schools, whatever, having those materials to hand, having some evidence, some facts, having a few key facts. Here's what we know, because you can use data, even bad data tells a story. And you can use that, give some key facts, and be specific and concrete in what you're asking for. And then, of course, follow up. And one of the saddest advocacy stories that I recall was a group of, it's a blind advocacy group that I visited many years ago with my colleague Stephanie Ordaleva, who now runs she's a blind lawyer, runs an organization called Women Enabled International. And so we were visiting this Moroccan group. We'd visited many groups, very good groups in Morocco, but this particular group was a rather sad group, not a lot of capacity. And it was a group of blind advocates, and they said, well, you know, we wrote a letter to the government once, and we never got a response. And we're like, wow, what are we going to do, you know? Okay, visit, follow up, you know. They really didn't, you know, they hadn't had the adequate training. They weren't networking with other groups from whom they could learn. There's some very, very good advocacy groups in Morocco, but they were disconnected from all of that. So that was a little bit of a sad, sad story. Other comments? Okay, so we're going to bring it to a close for today. And, you know, I think I hope we've gotten today is a little bit of a flavor for thinking about disability rights through the social model lens, and I think you all have a very good grasp of that, and how that sets the foundation for thinking about human rights, and human rights in a very comprehensive way, and we've covered a lot of ground. And then starting to think about how to frame our advocacy using human rights as a tool. Think a little bit more about how you're going to be able to work together and advocate together on the specific issues, many of which you've brought up today.